am afraid. I'm afraid of snakes. I'm afraid of unbelievably awkward social situations. I'm afraid of failing my sisters. I'm afraid of being and speaking on this very stage at this very moment. I'm afraid. That feeling that I get in the pit of my stomach, a fist slowly and silently tightening around my lungs. I can't breathe. I'm afraid. That fear, that terror will never go away. I can, however, learn to accept it. And to do so, in a way, I must understand it. And understanding a middle ground and attempt to find a compromise between ourselves and fear may take a little bit of digging and one too many far-fetched claims. By this, I mean the researching of epigenetics and how it can be inherited, the inheritance of fears and PTSDs. Epigenetics itself is, in a way, an inherited gene. Epigenetics and fear is the theory that fears, trauma, PTSDs, or whatever it is you want to call them, can be inherited by chemically tagging parts of our DNA. Epigenetics does not change our DNA. It does not change our genotype, from my understanding at least. When looking at research from British Society of Cell Biology, they claim we know that a part of how epigenetics works is by adding or removing small chemical tags to DNA. You can think of these tags as post-it notes that highlight particular genes with information about whether or not the gene should be switched on or off. In fact, the chemical tag in question is called a methyl group, and it is used to modify one of the 4 bases. This is a phenomenon that scientists are continuously trying to pick apart. I am no scientist, but to briefly explain for those who have an even lesser understanding than I do, DNA can never change. You were born with it, so you will now live with it. But epigenetic differences are caused by a chemical flag that attaches to DNA and changes the epigenetics rather than the genetic code itself. This theory of inherited fears first emerged after the Emory University conducted research with mice and the use of acetophenone. We are not mice, but we similarly associate our fears with specific images or encounters. Oh, and we share 92 of our DNA with them, which makes results far more realistic. For example, in the case of the mice, as they smelled acetophenone, which smelled like cherry blossoms, they would be slightly shocked, which caused them to fear the smell. The mice that would be reproduced would fear being shocked when smelling the same smell. It's safe to say we have traumatized these mice. This brings us to PTSD and epigenetics. Thankfully, for this aspect of epigenetics, mice aren't my only variable. New York Times author Benedict Carey writes, when explaining research from California, that trauma can leave a chemical mark on a person's genes, which is then passed on to subsequent generations. He claims that traumatic experiences, perhaps involving the Holocaust, Dutch Hunger Winter, and the Civil War, can leave a figurative mark, a wound, a scar, a so-called chemical tag. These figurative marks can be passed down without changing a person's DNA, not changing the genetics, but the epigenetics. Later on in the same article, Carey goes on to explain how these claims and theories are incredibly wild and perhaps far-fetched. We remain with no explanation. But perhaps we do inherit fears and traumas. Perhaps we have a way to fully understand the root of fears. Perhaps, or not. We as individual people are undeniably afraid. All of us have had moments where our hearts begin to beat far faster than they should. We begin to inhale more than we exhale, and somehow what has become second nature to us becomes difficult to do. We forget how to breathe. We are all afraid. Despite this, somehow, we are not cowards. I am not the only one here that is afraid, no matter how much we try to hide it. Somehow, day by day, hour by hour, minute by minute, we continue to face whatever it is that terrifies each of us. We somehow face our fears despite the ticking clock that tells us we are running out of time. I implore you, go against the racing clock and slay your demons, and find your bravery and everything else in between. We have to face our fears. Each for our own reasons, but there are still reasons nonetheless. Confront your fears, accept them as a part of who you are. There is no point in resenting them. But I warn you, do not blame them on an inherited gene or genotype or phenotype. We cannot play the blame game. Epigenetics and its association with fear and trauma does not necessarily justify our fears. It does not give us a reason to confront them. Ultimately, we don't face our fears because of the fact that a random person spews out in a speech or an article. We all have a reason, but not necessarily because of an understanding. Our reasons are never the same. I endure because of my sister. I have to be the role model. I have to convince her not to be afraid while pretending to not be afraid myself. I endure because there is no other option. It's either live or die, and I'd rather not die. So I endure, I accept, but I remain cautious. I remain cautious of the bundle of nerves trapped in a thin glass jar in the pit of my stomach. But I continue to try to be brave, to be courageous. I'm afraid of snakes. I'm afraid of unbelievably awkward social situations. I'm afraid of failing my sister. I'm afraid of being and speaking on this very stage at this very moment. I am afraid. And in the words of Sarah J. Maas, my name is Kauther Mohammed, and I will not be afraid.